If you needed to have a will drawn up, you'd go to an attorney who specialized in wills. If you needed to have a contract written, you'd go to an attorney who specializes in writing contracts. Similarly, if you're a father who wants to stay involved with his children after divorce or separation, you need to see an attorney who specializes in working with fathers in custody. We'll be talking to one of those today on Fathers Are Parents Too. Welcome to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Chicago trial attorney Jeffrey Leving, and Jeff specializes in representing fathers who are seeking to gain time with their children. Jeff, why is there a need for you to have this specialty? What's going on out there?
Well, I concentrate in helping fathers in custody and divorce cases because philosophically I believe it's important for me to do that. And years ago I practiced law working in a legal aid environment, and by going into court on somewhat of a consistent basis, I developed the opinion that there was a very strong bias against fathers, and I really didn't know any fathers that concentrated or limited their practices in helping fathers. So I decided that that was something I wanted to do, and I did it, and I still do it, and now I've put together a large group of attorneys in my firm. Actually, my firm now consists of 10 lawyers, 10 pro-male lawyers, and we represent fathers very aggressively, yet compassionately in reference to their needs in the court system.
Now you say pro-male attorneys. Are they also themselves all male, or do you have women in there as well?
We do have a woman, a female attorney, and she's very good, very, very sharp, and I consider her to be very, very sympathetic with the plight of males in our society, yet she's very aggressive in court, and she's an excellent lawyer, and I was very lucky to convince her to join the firm.
Now, what is the plight of males today in our courts?
Well, the biggest plight and the biggest problem of males in our legal system stems from societal gender bias against men. When I was growing up, I was taught to believe, just as many men in our society were taught and are taught to believe, that men primarily are basically piggy banks and sperm banks. Their primary role in life is earning money, paying child support, and having very little to do with their own children. And that's a big problem. And that problem has caused our society to fragment. And because of those biases, right now the United States is the world's leader in single-parent families. Right now, the United States basically has its population being broken down in such a manner that approximately 30% of all families are headed by a single parent. And that's horrible.
Now, do you happen to know of those 30% that are single-parent families, how that breaks down as between single female head of household and single male?
Well, my opinion would be that the majority of those households would be controlled by women. And now we have a society that is turning into a fatherless society, which is horrible because our fatherless society is what is causing increased crime, increased child poverty, it's increasing teenage pregnancies, it's causing a lot of societal problems. So right now, the best way to protect our society and decrease these societal problems is to re-engage fathers back to their children. Right now, this matter has become such an epidemic that an organization was formed called Father to Father outside, and it's within the University of Minnesota, and the honorary chairperson is Vice President Al Gore. So obviously, if the Vice President of the United States has this type of concern that he will involve himself in this type of organization, it tells me that there are not only problems, but people in high places are realizing that these problems exist and need to be dealt with quickly.
Let's go back to something so it doesn't get unaddressed, because I think it's an important point. You mentioned one of the problems in society is being child poverty. Now, of course, detractors would say, well, if those deadbeat dads just would pay their support, there wouldn't be child poverty. Obviously, you know, because of what you're doing, that it's not that simple. Why isn't it that simple? Why is that not the answer?
Well, it isn't that simple, and a lot of people in society want to blame fathers for everything. And a lot of people believe fathers are all deadbeats. They don't want to pay child support. They just want to avoid legal and other obligations to their children. And that's not true, but because of these societal biases, laws have been enacted to punish fathers. For instance, there is a law called the Uniform Reciprocal Enforcement of Support Act, whereby state and district attorneys' offices throughout the country work together chasing fathers. But there is no Uniform Reciprocal Enforcement of Visitation Act, whereas mothers can be followed throughout the United States because of visitation abuse. So it tells me in our society we are much more focused on child support, punishing fathers, putting fathers in jail, than in ensuring fathers' visitation. But the problem here is that visitation and child support socially and psychologically are interrelated. Now, if they are interrelated, and I'm not talking about legally, because legally they are not, generally.
You're talking emotionally and
exactly.
connection-wise.
And to support this, there's a government study. The United States Census Bureau conducted a study, and pursuant to this United States study, they found that there is a connection. And they found that fathers, pursuant to this study, with joint custody, paid over 90% of the child support owed, and fathers with visitation rights paid somewhere in the vicinity of 70%. But fathers without visitation, without joint custody, they paid less than 50% of the support owed. So it's obvious from this United States government study that a big problem in the support arrearage arena is fathers are not getting to see their children. So if we know this is a problem, and we know that if we can re-engage fathers back with their children, that money will be paid, and if we also know that by re-engaging fathers back with their children will be emotionally supported and protected, then why don't we do it? And to further support this problem, and from my further research, I've discovered that the majority of adult inmates, male adult inmates in the prison system who have been convicted of violent crimes grew up in fatherless families.
Now that's interesting, because certainly there are groups that would have you believe that they grew up watching their fathers beating their mothers, and that's what made them become violent. But what you're saying is it was the absence of any male role model at all, it sounds like, that leads to this.
The absence of a healthy biological paternal role model is horrible, and I believe that causes children to grow up to become dysfunctional adults and possibly end up in the penitentiary system.
Or becoming their own, becoming single parents themselves, raising again another generation of fatherless children. Now, often I'm asked, is there any advantage to having a male or female attorney if you're a father going into court? And I want to just jump back a moment to, you mentioned you have this one woman attorney in your firm, and obviously you have male attorneys in your firm. Have you noticed any distinguishable difference in terms of how the courts view, or is there any benefit to having a male versus a female attorney as a father?
Generally not, but there are exceptions. For instance, in Chicago, where my practice is based out of, I do know one judge where I believe a father is better off being represented by a female attorney. And I don't think it's right, but I just believe that female attorneys have more credibility representing fathers in front of this one specific judge. But it depends on the judge, on the case, but there is one judge that I think female attorneys have a better chance in litigating in front of.
Now, talking judge to judge, and then also jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now, I believe you've been in other courts outside of Chicago. Is that correct? Yeah.
Correct. I have.
Do you notice any difference generally across from state to state or court to court in terms of how fathers are being viewed going in, wanting time with their children? Is it pretty much terrible everywhere? Are there some states that you know of that are maybe a bit more progressive and father aware than others?
Well, I think some states are more conservative than others. I've represented fathers in Florida, actually I represented a father in California, I've represented fathers in Massachusetts, Iowa, and I think unfortunately the system primarily is biased against fathers. If you want me to pick out one system that may be more biased than another, I think Massachusetts support guidelines are more pro-female than the guidelines in Illinois, because I represented a father in Massachusetts, and their support guidelines, in my opinion, were very archaic and very, very pro-female. However, I shouldn't be too critical because I was real happy with the results I got in that courtroom.
So now how do you do that? You live and practice in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to go and then work, say if a father wanted to work with your firm who lived in Massachusetts? How does that work? I thought you had to stay in the state that you practice in.
Well, generally what I would do, and normally I try and stay in Illinois because it's difficult for me physically to litigate in multiple states because it takes an incredible amount of energy to travel for the purpose of litigation. But when I go into another state, I generally will retain a local attorney who will go in and file a motion pro hoc vice asking the court to give me permission to practice law in that jurisdiction.
For that particular case.
For that particular case.
And really that sort of leads me to what I was getting at, which is when you do that, do you keep that attorney in the case as well? Is there not a home field advantage to knowing, you know, the local players, and for a local attorney versus someone coming in from, because a lot of times I know that that's a question people have, is should I get someone who's right here in my town who knows everybody, or should I get this hotshot, you know, father's rights attorney from another part of the state or another state?
Generally, I will want a local attorney to work with me. I haven't always done that. I was involved in one case where I suspected that the local attorney was basically working against me, and I felt that he was very supportive and sympathetic toward the other attorney and the other attorney's client. So in that situation, even though he was of record, after the first court date, he didn't show up to court anymore, and I was happy he didn't, and everything I did was to his exclusion because of my concerns.
Well, maybe he was so sympathetic to the other side because they had to deal with you.
Well, that could have been it.
Now, is there sort of a general pattern that the cases that come to you take that you can recognize as the people, the new clients come to you, oh, this is how this case is going to shape up, and sort of warning signs you look for that you can share with the audience to let them know sort of pitfalls to avoid?
Well, the pitfalls to avoid would be very difficult to sum up within a short period of time.
Okay.
But what I did do, I wrote an article for the Association of Trial Lawyers of America on the father's custody case, and I flew to New York City and I gave a lecture in front of a group of lawyers who were members, I assume they were members, of the Association of Trial Lawyers of America on how to represent a father in a custody case. Now, the article that I wrote, if anybody is interested in calling in, I'd be glad to provide you with copies to distribute, but I put together a pretty comprehensive article which basically followed my speech on what to do, what not to do, and what to look out for.
And can you give us just a couple of examples of what you told those lawyers to look out for?
Well, one issue that I focused on was preparation, because I've beaten a lot of lawyers primarily because they were not prepared. You have to prepare, and you have to know how to prepare, and you have to have a strategy. A lot of lawyers don't have strategies. A lot of them do, but I've handled cases against lawyers that would file pleadings. They would do certain things without knowing why they were doing them and how it would affect the case down the line. Whatever you do in a case, you have to know how it will affect the future of the case, and you have to be prepared. And those really are the two keys. One thing I do tell my clients is that in protecting yourself, keep in mind that private detectives often are used in contested custody cases. So when you throw out your garbage, if there's anything you throw out that's of a confidential or sensitive nature, cut it up in little tiny pieces, because detectives will often go through garbage, abandoned garbage, and look for documents or letters from lawyers, or letters to psychologists, or letters from school teachers to parents concerning negative conduct of the children, and they'll go through the garbage, and that information can end up being used possibly as evidence. So I generally tell my clients, be careful what you throw out, because whatever you throw out, the other side may end up using against you.
So it sounds like part of good preparation is realizing that everything you do may be ultimately brought to the attention of the other side, and to also have a perspective as to how the other side might view something, which may be very differently than how you would view the same thing. We're going to be right back after a short break, and we have some questions for you from the audience. We'll be right back.
I'm a dad and a member of FREE, the Father's Rights and Equality Exchange. Most dads out there would love to spend more time with their kids and to be a real part of their lives. FREE wants to change the notion that all divorced and unmarried dads are irresponsible, because most of us dads are responsible, and we're working for the chance to share the parenting. If you want to learn more, please call us at 1-500-4DADS. That's 1-500-4DADS. And remember, fathers are parents too.
Welcome back to Fathers Are Parents Too. Today we're talking to Chicago trial attorney Jeff Leving, and we have some questions for Jeff from the audience. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned previously about the lack of an interstate visitation act. What is the state of enforcement of visitation across state lines? Is it totally the Wild West, or what is an attorney to do, or what is a father to do if he has children in another state and mom won't let him see them when he goes and visits?
Your term, the Wild West, is interesting because you may have hit the nail right on the head. It is sort of like the Wild West in trying to enforce visitation. The problem, if a father wants to enforce visitation, he can file a petition for a rule to show cause in the state he is living in and the state the mother is living in, and try and get a civil contempt finding, which can be punishable by incarceration, which generally is not, because civil contempt is almost meaningless, because in a civil contempt finding, the judge must give the wrongdoer the key to the jailhouse door, meaning he must give her the ability to purge herself of contempt. Now, the second problem becomes, what if she leaves the state? Then the father will probably follow her, file a petition for a rule, and try and get a contempt finding in another state. And that's very difficult. And then what if the mother moves again and he's just continually chasing her? Now, since there is no uniform reciprocal enforcement of visitation act, which correlates to the uniform reciprocal enforcement of support act, the father is in a situation where he probably needs money, unless he gets lucky and the mother happens to move to a state where there is a criminal visitation interference statute. Now, in Illinois, we have a new law which makes which criminalizes visitation interference. So if a mother is convicted 3 times, on the 3rd conviction, she can go to jail up to 1 year, and it becomes a Class A misdemeanor. The problem here is that if the mother is in California or Nevada or wherever, and she moves to Illinois, and she's convicted once, what if she moves from Illinois to another state? Then the father has to chase her again. So it is very similar to the Wild West, and it is very difficult for a father to protect his rights with his children. But I don't think fathers should give up, but it's very, very difficult. But the benefit of a criminal conviction for visitation interference, as opposed to a civil conviction, is a criminal conviction is not one where the judge must give the mother a key to the jailhouse door. The judge can't say, listen, ma'am, if you perform 20 hours of community service, you don't have to go to jail. If it's a criminal conviction, that doesn't work. She can't purge herself of civil contempt. She probably goes to jail. So a criminal conviction is much stronger.
Now let me ask you, you mentioned the mother who's moving from state to state to state, and my understanding is that in most states she needs to have been there at least a short period of time before an action can be brought against her in that state. So is there a period of time within which if the mother moves, the father, it would behoove him to bring an action in the old state or in his state to sort of not give her time to get a new residency? Or?
Well, here's what I generally would like to do, and a lot of it depends on, one, how hard the father wants to fight, and also part of it is financial. I had one case where the mother moved from Illinois to Minnesota, and I figured, well, I could go file a petition for a rule in Illinois, or I can go to Minnesota and file one. Instead, what I did was I filed a petition for custody, and I ended up getting custody in Illinois. Now that changed the whole ball game.
Oh, yeah.
So if you want to hit her real hard and you can get a change of custody, then you have a much better chance of protecting your rights. Another possible way would be investigating a tort action against the mother if she has money. For instance, in Illinois, you can sue a woman for the intentional infliction of emotional distress because of visitation abuse. Now, if the mother is very wealthy and you serve her with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, chances are her eyes are going to open up and she's going to realize she can be in trouble. So you have to evaluate all the different alternatives and see which one will work specifically in your case. Now, obviously, the point you brought up is an excellent point, but this subject can get somewhat complicated and you really need to handcraft it to the individual case. But that one case I referred to earlier, where I obtained custody for the father in Illinois, that caused the mother to return from Minnesota to Illinois and bring the child back. Now, unfortunately, that was a horrible case because in that case, the father was actually shot to death by the mother's father, and the child. I hope to God the child's okay, because even though the father is no longer here, he dearly loved his daughter. But these are some of the tragedies that happen in these cases, and this client actually became a friend of mine through all the litigation, and that is something that really bothers me, and I think about that, and that is one of the motivating factors I continue to fight for fathers, because of what happened to that one father.
Wow. Oh, we have another question.
Yeah, I just wondered if the courts listen to what the children want, and if so, what age might that happen?
Well, that question should be looked at basically on a state-by-state basis. Different states have different laws on that issue, but strategies generally are the same wherever you go. In Illinois, there is no specific age. However, in-camera interviews, which are interviews where the judge can talk to the children, must be handled properly, or an attorney could destroy his client's case. For instance, if there's going to be an in-camera interview, you know, if the other side or the mother brings the child to the judge, there's a chance she may be coaching the child or children, and then the in-camera interview will proceed with coached children, with the children telling the judge what the mother wanted them to say. So that's one problem to watch out for in-camera interviews. Also, if you bring the children there, be sure they're not coached, because a judge may be more sensitive to coaching if the coaching was done by the father than if done by the mother. So be very careful on that issue. Also, if attorneys if the attorneys are involved in the in-camera process, it's often a good idea that the attorney prepares questions and presents them to the court, and hopefully the judge will follow some of the questions presented by the attorney. Because, for instance, if I know there's going to be an in-camera interview, I know which questions will probably help my client and hurt my client. So I will present a list of questions, and obviously I'm not going to write the ones down that'll hurt my client, so I write down the ones that'll help. And the other attorney, hopefully the other attorney is half asleep and doesn't even have a list of questions.
That actually brings up something I wanted to mention. You were talking way back at the top of the show about sometimes the attorneys you're up against don't even prepare, and I have found that sadly the area of family law seems to be one where attorneys who really don't have a lot on the ball tend to gravitate, which isn't to say that all family law attorneys are not sharp and don't prepare, but I have found it to be more true in family law that there are attorneys practicing who don't really know a great deal about, say, litigation, for example, or how to prepare a case, because they just sort of, it's a very easy area of practice to go out and open, hang a shingle, and suddenly you're a lawyer in practice. And so I don't know if you found that to be the case as well, but sadly I have found that to be the case where I am.
I agree with you. When I was in New York lecturing in front of a group of lawyers on how to win a custody case for a father, some lawyers came up to me with questions that I couldn't even believe they didn't know the answers to. And it's frightening. And unfortunately, there are a lot of attorneys that aren't very sharp. Now, I know of your reputation, and I've actually spoken to some of your clients, so I know that you're an exception. I know you're incredibly sharp as a trial lawyer, but most trial lawyers in matrimonial law, I don't believe, have your skill. And that is a negative and a positive. It's a positive for me because when I have a lawyer that isn't skillful, then I could probably eat him alive. But it could be a problem for a father if a father is relying on an incompetent lawyer to protect his relationship with his children.
Right. And on that complimentary note, for which I thank you very much, we have another question from the audience. Yes.
Yes, I have a question. I'm not sure if a lawyer could really handle this. I have a horrible case that's been in litigation on child custody and child support for over 5 years, and it's been ongoing. I've completely depleted all of my funds within the first year and a half. I've been in pro per and in forma pauperis for 3.5 years, and I now am in a situation where I've completely lost custody. I've lost visitation. I have very little phone contact with my children, and even though they're within 10 miles of where I live, I only see them like every couple of months or something like that, occasionally when they visit my parents, so they have a grandparental visitation. The question I have is, I have children who are now age 12 and twins who are age 10. My son, who is now 12, is going to be 13. Is it possible that somehow he could simply get on the bus and with his suitcase come over to my house and say he wants to live with me? Or do I have to go to court?
Well, he could do that. That doesn't mean legally you have the right to have him live with you on a full-time basis. What I would like to do, and I'd be willing to do this after the show, if you have a court file with you or documents that I could look at and review so I could learn what your rights are or what they are not. I mean, for instance, if the mother has custody and hypothetically, because I don't know, you have your visitation rights are terminated and there's some type of injunctive relief against you that you can't be with the children or the child, and then you take the child into your home, well then in that situation you should go into court immediately and try and modify all those orders, or you may have a big problem. Okay. So I'd probably have to know.
Now we have just a couple of seconds left, and if this fellow wanted to call you or anyone watching the show wanted to call you, do you have a number you'd like to give out?
My number in Chicago is 312-807-3990, and I do have a brochure that I put together on father's rights, and if anybody's interested in a complimentary copy, if they call 312-807-3990, they can have a copy.
That's wonderful. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. That's Chicago attorney Jeff Leving. And audience, thank you for being here. And join us next week on Fathers Are Parents Too.